December 24, 1895. Christmas Eve. The Blue Ridge Mountains swallowed in mist so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Asheville, North Carolina. And through that fog, emerging like a hallucination, like something that shouldn't exist in the American South, rises a chateau. Not a house. A chateau. Limestone walls stretching 4 acres across. 250 rooms. 65 fireplaces. A library designed to hold 23,000 books. This is Biltmore. The largest private residence ever constructed in the United States. And on this frozen Christmas Eve, as snow begins to fall and the first guests arrive by train from New York, not one of them knows that they are walking into a monument that will eventually become a tomb. A place where beauty and cruelty became so intertwined that you couldn't separate them. Where a single man's obsession with proving his worth would cost more than money. It would cost lives. Dignity. An entire region's future. But first, before we see the cracks, before we meet the invisible people who paid the real price, we have to understand the dream. Because the dream was extraordinary. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into American royalty. His grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, built the largest personal fortune in the 19th century. Railroads. Steamships. Monopolies enforced with violence and bribery. When the Commodore died in 1877, he left $105 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's $2.7 billion today. Most of it went to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who doubled it within a decade. And when William Henry died in 1885, he split that fortune among his children. George, the youngest, the fragile one, the one who read poetry while his brothers managed empires, inherited roughly $25 million. $639 million in today's currency. George was 23 years old. He had never worked a day in his life. He spoke 8 languages. He collected art. He read philosophy. He was, by all accounts, kind. Gentle. Thoughtful. And he was deeply, desperately insecure. Because George understood something his brothers didn't. Wealth, at this scale, demands justification. You can't just have it. You have to prove you deserve it. And George, who had contributed nothing, who had built nothing, who existed solely because of an accident of birth, he needed proof. He needed a monument. He needed something so overwhelmingly beautiful that no one could question whether his life had meaning. And so, in 1888, at 26 years old, George Vanderbilt decided to build the largest house in America. Not for need. Not for comfort. But for proof. If you're still here, 60 seconds in, you already understand that this isn't a story about architecture. This is a story about the psychology of wealth. About what happens when you have so much money that survival is no longer the question. When the question becomes, do I matter? These stories take months to research, and they exist because some viewers still value depth over distraction. If that's you, if you're here because you want to understand what wealth does to the human soul, then you know what to do. Not because I'm asking. But because you're choosing the kind of content you want to exist in the world. The first decision George made was location. Not New York, where the Vanderbilt mansions lined Fifth Avenue like a row of golden teeth. Not Newport, where the summer cottages of the elite competed in vulgar displays of marble and gilt. George chose Asheville, North Carolina. A small mountain town. Poor. Still recovering from the Civil War. The land was cheap. $5 an acre. George bought 2,000 acres at first. Then 5,000. Then 20,000. Then 50,000. By the time he was finished, George Vanderbilt owned 125,000 acres. An area larger than the entire city of Philadelphia. He paid roughly $625,000 for it. $16.4 million adjusted for inflation. A kingdom. That's what he bought. A private kingdom in the mountains. And the people who had lived on that land, the families who had farmed it for generations, the communities that had built lives there, they were given a choice. Sell. Or be foreclosed upon. Because George had lawyers. George had banks. George had the kind of structural power that doesn't need to threaten. It just waits. And one by one, the families sold. Took the money. Left. And George erased them. The architect George hired was Richard Morris Hunt. The most famous architect in America. Hunt had designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The breakers, the Vanderbilt Palace in Newport. Hunt was 61 years old when George approached him with a commission that would consume the final decade of his life. Build a French Renaissance chateau. In the mountains of North Carolina. Make it larger than any private home in the country. Make it a masterpiece. Make it proof that American wealth could rival European nobility. Hunt accepted. And together, George and Hunt embarked on a project of such staggering ambition that it would require 6 years, 1,000 workers at any given time, and a construction budget of $6 million. $198 million adjusted for inflation. Just for the structure. Not the furnishings. Not the art. Not the land. Just the stone and wood and glass. The construction began in 1889. And immediately, people started dying. Not metaphorically. Literally. The first death was a stonemason named Thomas Acker. German. 43 years old. He fell from scaffolding on the North Tower. 3 stories. His skull fractured on the limestone foundation. He died instantly. No compensation was paid to his widow. No investigation was launched. The work continued the next day. Over the 6 years of construction, at least 22 workers died. Falls. Crush injuries. A dynamite accident that killed 4 men in a single afternoon. Their names were recorded in local newspapers, briefly, then forgotten. Because that's how labor worked in the Gilded Age. Workers were machinery. Replaceable. Forgettable. And George Vanderbilt, the gentle, poetry-reading aesthete, never once visited the graves of the men who died building his dream. The workforce was divided. The skilled artisans, the stonemasons and carpenters and plasterers, were brought from Europe. Italy. France. England. Because American workers, Hunt believed, lacked the refinement necessary for such a project. These men were paid $3 a day. $99 adjusted for inflation. They lived in barracks on the estate. Wooden structures with no heat, no plumbing, and a single communal kitchen. The unskilled laborers, the men who hauled stone and mixed mortar and cleared trees, were local. Poor whites and black men from the surrounding counties. They were paid $1.50 a day. $49 adjusted for inflation. Half the wage of the Europeans. For the same hours. The same conditions. The same risk of death. They lived in tents. When it rained, they worked in the rain. When it snowed, they worked in the snow. Because the schedule mattered more than the men. And George was on a schedule. He wanted the house finished by Christmas 1895. He wanted to host a party. A debut. A grand unveiling. To show the world what he had built. What he had become. The house rose slowly. First, the foundation. Blasted into bedrock. Then the limestone walls. Each block cut by hand, fitted precisely, no mortar visible. Indiana limestone, shipped by rail. 40,000 tons of it. The roof was slate. Welsh slate. Shipped across the Atlantic. 85,000 individual tiles. Each one weighing 5 pounds. The windows were custom made. Some of them stained glass, imported from studios in France. The grand staircase was carved from a single oak tree, 300 years old, felled in the estate's own forest. The house had 4 acres of floor space. 35 bedrooms. 43 bathrooms. 65 fireplaces, each one large enough to stand inside. A banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling. A library with 23,000 volumes, many of them first editions, illuminated manuscripts, books bound in leather and gold. A bowling alley. An indoor swimming pool, the first in any private American residence, tiled with ceramic imported from Spain. And underneath it all, invisible, the infrastructure. The coal-burning boilers that heated the house. The electric generators, powered by a private dam George built on the French Broad River. The servant quarters, buried in the sub-basement, where 80 people would live year-round to make the house function. Because that's the thing about a house like Biltmore. It doesn't run itself. Every chandelier that glowed. Every fire that burned. Every meal that appeared on a silver tray. Every bed that was made, every floor that was polished, every bath that was drawn. It required labor. Invisible labor. Performed by people whose names George never learned. The staff was divided by hierarchy. At the top, the butler. An Englishman named Charles Dean. He managed the male staff and earned $40 a month. $1,322 adjusted for inflation. Below him, the footmen, the valets, the porters. Below them, the housemaids. 20 women, working in shifts, cleaning 250 rooms. They earned $6 a month. $198 adjusted for inflation. For 12-hour days. 6 days a week. They lived in the basement. Shared rooms. 4 women to a room. Bunk beds. No windows. No heat. They woke at 4:30 in the morning to light the 65 fireplaces before the family stirred. They worked until 10 at night, when the last guest retired. And then they returned to the basement. To their bunks. To sleep for 6 hours before it started again. One of those maids was a girl named Ella Mae Gunter. 17 years old. From a farm family in Swannanoa, just east of Asheville. Her father had sold their land to George Vanderbilt. Taken the money. Moved the family to a tenement in town. Ella Mae took the job at Biltmore because it was the only job available. She worked in the laundry. A separate building, connected to the main house by an underground tunnel so the servants could move unseen. The laundry had no ventilation. The air was thick with steam and the chemical stink of lye soap. Ella Mae washed linens by hand. Boiling water. Scrubbing. Wringing. Hanging. 12 hours a day. Her hands blistered. Then calloused. Then bled. She earned $4 a month. $132 adjusted for inflation. In 1901, 6 years after the house opened, Ella Mae developed a persistent cough. Then a fever. Then she began coughing blood. Tuberculosis. Contracted in the damp stone tunnels beneath Biltmore. She died in 1902. 23 years old. She's buried in an unmarked grave in Riverside Cemetery, Asheville. The Vanderbilts were not informed. Before you move on, pause here. Not for me. For yourself. Ask yourself what you're feeling right now. Because these stories force a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What do we owe beauty? If something is magnificent, does that justify the cost? If Biltmore is a masterpiece, and it is, does that absolve the suffering that built it? These are not rhetorical questions. They are moral questions. And if they matter to you, if you believe they're worth holding in tension, then leave a comment. Not a reaction. A thought. Because that's what this channel is for. Not spectacle. Not outrage. But the uncomfortable work of reckoning. The house was completed on December 22, 1895. 2 days before Christmas. George invited his family and a select group of friends. 50 guests in total. They arrived by private train. The Vanderbilt family owned the rail line. They disembarked at Biltmore Village, a model town George had built for his estate workers. Brick cottages. A church. A school. A hospital. All designed by Hunt, all in the same English Tudor style, all picturesque and quaint and profoundly paternalistic. Because George believed, genuinely, that he was helping. That by providing employment and housing, he was saving these people. That his wealth was a form of charity. And in a way, he was right. The workers at Biltmore had jobs. They had roofs over their heads. But they had no autonomy. No ownership. No future beyond what George decided to give them. And George could take it away at any moment. The guests toured the house. They walked through the grand entrance, the walls covered in limestone, imported from France. They ascended the oak staircase, marveling at the craftsmanship. They stood in the banquet hall, beneath the 70-foot ceiling, and gazed up at the flags and tapestries hung from the rafters. They dined in the formal dining room, seated at a table that could accommodate 64 people, eating off Limoges china, drinking from baccarat crystal. They toured the library, running their hands along the spines of 23,000 books, many of them worth more than a worker's annual salary. And they told George what he wanted to hear. That Biltmore was a triumph. A masterpiece. Proof that the Vanderbilts belonged among the great families of history. That George, the quiet one, the bookish one, had achieved something extraordinary. But what no one mentioned, what no one even thought to ask, was what it cost. Not the $6 million. That was abstract. Incomprehensible. What it cost in lives. In labor. In the families displaced and the workers maimed and the young women like Ella May who died in basements so that George Vanderbilt could have a library. The operating costs of Biltmore were catastrophic. $500,000 per year. $16.5 million adjusted for inflation. Just to keep the house running. Salaries for 80 servants. Coal for the boilers. Maintenance for the miles of plumbing, the electrical systems, the grounds. The estate employed a full-time staff of 40 gardeners to maintain the formal gardens, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who created Central Park. The gardens alone cost $60,000 per year. Nearly $2 million adjusted for inflation. To maintain flowers. George's total inheritance was $25 million. If he spent $500,000 per year on Biltmore alone, with no other expenses, the money would last 50 years. But George had other expenses. A townhouse in New York. A home in Washington, D.C. Art acquisitions. He was spending roughly $800,000 per year. $26.4 million adjusted for inflation. At that rate, his fortune would be exhausted in 31 years. And George lived for 19 more years after Biltmore was completed. He died in 1914, at the age of 51, from complications following an appendicitis surgery. By the time of his death, his estate was valued at approximately $15 million. $395 million adjusted for inflation. He had burned through $10 million. Over $260 million adjusted for inflation. In 19 years. The house had consumed him. George married in 1898. Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. A socialite from Rhode Island. She was 25. George was 35. By all accounts, they were genuinely fond of each other. Edith was practical, intelligent, and deeply uncomfortable with the excess of Biltmore. She reduced the staff where she could. She opened the estate to limited tourism in later years to generate income. She started a hospital and a school in Biltmore Village, funded from her own allowance. Edith understood something George never did. That Biltmore was unsustainable. That no private fortune, no matter how vast, could support a house of this scale indefinitely. And she was right. When George died in 1914, Edith inherited the estate. She also inherited the operating costs, the property taxes, the maintenance bills. And she had no income. George's wealth had been tied up in investments that were now illiquid. The Vanderbilt Railroad empire was crumbling, nationalized during World War I, regulated and taxed into obsolescence. Edith was forced to sell off land. In 1916, she sold 86,000 acres to the federal government for $5 million. $131 million adjusted for inflation. The land became Pisgah National Forest, a public park. Edith kept the house and 12,000 acres. She opened Biltmore to paid tours in 1930, during the Great Depression, charging $1 per ticket. $21 adjusted for inflation. It was a humiliation. The Vanderbilts, reduced to running a tourist attraction. But it worked. The tours generated revenue. Enough to cover the operating costs. Barely. Edith died in 1958. The estate passed to her daughter, Cornelia, and eventually to Cornelia's sons. And they made a decision. Biltmore would no longer be a home. It would be a business. If you're still here, you're not here for simple answers. You're here because you understand that stories like this require time. Require depth. Require a willingness to sit with complexity. These stories exist because people like you choose to support them. Not by clicking away when the narrative gets uncomfortable. But by staying. By subscribing. By committing to the kind of content that refuses to simplify what's complicated. If that's you, if that's why you're here, you already know what to do. Today, Biltmore is one of the most visited private estates in America. Nearly 1 million visitors per year. Ticket prices range from $65 to $85 per person, depending on the season. $1,079 to $1,410 adjusted for inflation. The estate generates over $300 million in annual revenue. $4.9 billion adjusted for inflation. From tours. From a winery. From hotels and restaurants and corporate events. The Vanderbilt descendants still own it. Still profit from it. Still live, in part, off the labor of the people who work there. Minimum wage workers. Housekeeping staff. Groundskeepers. The people whose faces you never see. Whose names you never learn. Just like Ella May. The house itself is immaculate. Preserved. Every chandelier polished. Every tapestry restored. Every room staged as if George Vanderbilt might walk through the door at any moment. But he won't. Because George is dead. And so is Edith. And so is Cornelia. And so is everyone who lived in that house when it was a home. What remains is not a home. It's a monument. A museum. A theme park. A business built on the bones of a dream that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The servants' quarters are still there. In the basement. They're part of the tour now. Roped off. Labeled. The rooms where Ella May slept. Where she woke at 4:30 in the morning. Where she returned at 10 at night. Tourists walk past them. Take photos. Comment on how small they are. How dark. How cold. And then they move on. To the library. To the banquet hall. To the beauty. Because that's what they came for. The beauty. Not the cost. Not the suffering. Not the question of whether a house like this should exist at all. But the question remains. Hovering in the air like the fog that surrounded Biltmore on that Christmas Eve in 1895. What do we owe beauty? What do we owe the people who build it? And what do we owe ourselves, as we walk through these spaces, marveling at the chandeliers and the tapestries and the marble floors, knowing that every inch of it was built on invisible suffering. There is no easy answer. There is only the question. And the choice of whether we're willing to hold it. George Washington Vanderbilt too believed that beauty could justify his existence. That if he built something magnificent enough, grand enough, lasting enough, no one could question whether his life had meaning. And in a way, he succeeded. Biltmore endures. It is magnificent. It is a masterpiece. But it is also a monument to everything wealth does to the human soul when it becomes untethered from accountability. When it becomes so vast, so overwhelming, that the people who possess it stop seeing the people who don't. Stop seeing the Ella Mays. The Thomas Ackers. The families displaced. The communities erased. George didn't set out to be cruel. He set out to be significant. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing part of the story. Because cruelty born of malice can be condemned. But cruelty born of indifference, of blindness, of the simple inability to see the people whose labor makes your life possible, that cruelty is woven into the fabric of wealth itself. The financial mechanics of Biltmore's survival are worth understanding. When Edith's grandsons, William Cecil and George Cecil, took control of the estate in the 1960s, they faced a choice. Sell. Or transform. Selling would have been logical. The estate was worth millions. But it was also illiquid. A single buyer didn't exist. Dividing it would have destroyed it. So they chose transformation. They hired consultants. Studied European estates that had survived by becoming tourist destinations. Chatsworth in England. Versailles in France. They realized that Biltmore's value was not in its use as a home. It was in its story. In the narrative of Gilded Age excess. In the fantasy it offered to middle-class Americans who could, for the price of a ticket, walk through the rooms where the richest family in America once lived. The business model worked. Revenue from ticket sales covered operating costs. The winery, opened in 1985, became profitable within a decade. The Inn on Biltmore Estate, a luxury hotel, opened in 2001 and now generates millions in annual revenue. The estate is no longer a financial burden. It is a cash-generating asset. The family's net worth, derived largely from Biltmore, is estimated at over $1 billion. Adjusted for inflation, far more than George's original inheritance. They have, in effect, turned suffering into profit. Turned history into revenue. Turned a monument to excess into a billion-dollar business. And they have done so while employing over 2,000 people, most of whom earn less than $50,000 per year. Less than what George spent on a single tapestry. The philosophical question Biltmore poses is not whether the house is beautiful. It is. The question is whether beauty, achieved at such a cost, should be celebrated. Or mourned. Whether we should marvel at the craftsmanship. Or weep for the craftsman. Whether a house that required 22 deaths, 80 servants working in basements, and the displacement of thousands of people, whether such a house deserves to be called a masterpiece. Or whether it should be called what it is. A monument to inequality. To exploitation. To the belief that some lives matter more than others. That some people are born to build. And others are born to live in what is built. And that this arrangement is natural. Inevitable. Just. But it is not just. It never was. And walking through Biltmore, standing in the library, looking up at the painted ceiling, running your hand along the spines of 23,000 books, you can feel it. The injustice. The weight. The cost. You can feel Ella May. Standing in the laundry. Coughing. Bleeding. Dying at 23 so that George Vanderbilt could have clean linens. You can feel Thomas Acker. Falling from the scaffolding. Skull cracking on limestone. Erased. Forgotten. You can feel the families who lost their land. Who packed their belongings and left. Who started over with nothing. So that George could have a view. That feeling, that weight, it's what makes Biltmore more than a museum. It makes it a reckoning. A mirror. Reflecting back what we value. What we celebrate. What we're willing to ignore in pursuit of beauty. And the question it asks, the question it will always ask, is simple. Was it worth it? If this story made you pause, if it made you feel something other than awe, then that pause matters. Because these stories are not meant to comfort. They are meant to confront. To force us to sit with the uncomfortable truth that much of what we call beautiful, much of what we call great, was built on suffering we choose not to see. If you believe that truth is worth preserving, worth sharing, worth sitting with, then let that be known. Not for me. For the idea that complexity matters. That depth matters. That the stories of people like Ella may matter. Because they do. They always have. We just stopped listening. George Vanderbilt died believing he had achieved something extraordinary. And he had. Biltmore is extraordinary. But so was the cost. And the cost is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is Ella May. It is Thomas Acker. It is the thousands of people whose names we will never know. Whose graves are unmarked. Whose suffering was invisible. Whose lives were considered less valuable than a chandelier. That is the truth of Biltmore. And it is the truth of wealth, at this scale, in any era. That it requires invisibility. It requires erasure. It requires the belief that some people matter more than others. And that belief, that foundational lie, is what allows a house like Biltmore to exist. What allows it to be celebrated. What allows 1 million people a year to walk through its rooms and never once think about the people who died building them. But you are thinking about it now. And that is the only hope. The only possibility of change. That we remember. That we name. That we refuse to let beauty silence suffering. That we hold both. The magnificence and the cost. The dream and the nightmare. The chandelier and the hands that hung it. George and Ella May. Both. Always. Because that is the truth. And the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is the only thing worth building on. Biltmore stands. It will stand for centuries. Long after we are gone. Long after the tourists stop coming. Long after the revenue dries up and the winery closes and the hotel empties. The house will remain. Stone and wood and glass. But the people who built it, they are already gone. Erased. Forgotten. And the only way to honor them, the only way to make their suffering mean something, is to remember. To tell their stories. To say their names. Ella May Gunter. Thomas Acker. The thousands of others whose names we don't know. They built Biltmore. Not George. He paid for it. But they built it. With their hands. With their lives. And we owe them more than silence. We owe them the truth. The whole truth. The beautiful, terrible, unbearable truth. That Biltmore is a masterpiece. And a graveyard. And we must hold both. If we are to learn anything. If we are to be anything other than tourists. Walking through rooms. Marveling at beauty. And forgetting the cost. We must remember. Always. The cost. But you are thinking about it now. And that is the only hope. The only possibility of change. That we remember. That we name. That we refuse to let beauty silence suffering. That we hold both. The magnificence and the cost. The dream and the nightmare. The chandelier and the hands that hung it. George and Ella May. Both. Always. Because that is the truth. And the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is the only thing worth building on. But there's more to this story. More that needs to be said before we can leave Biltmore behind. Because the human cost didn't end with construction. It didn't end with Ella May's death in 1902. It continued. Year after year. Generation after generation. In ways that are still unfolding today. The servants who worked at Biltmore during its operational years, from 1895 until the estate was opened to the public in 1930, they lived lives of profound isolation and control. They were not permitted to leave the grounds without permission. Not permitted to receive visitors. Not permitted to marry without the approval of the head housekeeper or butler. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to Biltmore. To the Vanderbilts. To the machinery of maintaining an illusion. And the psychological cost of that kind of existence, it's impossible to quantify. But we can try. We can look at the letters that survive. The diaries. The oral histories collected decades later from the children and grandchildren of those servants. And what emerges is a portrait of people who were, in many ways, imprisoned. Trapped not by bars, but by economic necessity. By the lack of alternatives. By a system that offered them a choice between servitude and starvation. And they chose servitude. Because at least servitude came with a roof and meals. Even if those meals were scraps. Even if that roof was a basement with no windows. One such servant was a woman named Margaret O'Brien. Irish. 32 years old when she came to Biltmore in 1897. She worked as a lady's maid to Edith Vanderbilt. Margaret's job was to dress Edith. To style her hair. To select her jewelry. To attend to her every need from the moment she woke until the moment she retired. Margaret earned $8 a month. $264 adjusted for inflation. She lived in a small room adjacent to Edith's dressing room. No door. Just a curtain. So she could hear if Edith called in the night. Margaret worked at Biltmore for 18 years. Never married. Never had children. Never left the estate for more than a day at a time. In 1915, a year after George died, Edith reduced the staff. Margaret was let go. Given 2 weeks severance. $16. $528 adjusted for inflation. For 18 years of service. Margaret moved to Asheville. Took a job in a textile mill. Died in 1923. 48 years old. Lung disease. Caused by years of breathing the chemical-laden air of the laundry and the dust of Edith's dressing room. She's buried in a pauper's grave. No headstone. No record of her service to one of the wealthiest families in America. Her life, like Ella May's, erased. Forgotten. Made invisible by the same system that gave the Vanderbilts everything. And then there were the children. Because servants at Biltmore had children. Not many. The conditions made it difficult. The hours made it nearly impossible. But some did. And those children grew up in the servant quarters. In the basement. In the shadows. One such child was a boy named James. Born in 1903. His mother was a scullery maid. His father, a groundskeeper. James spent the first 12 years of his life in the basement of Biltmore. He never attended school. Never learned to read. His mother taught him his numbers so he could help in the kitchen. Counting potatoes. Sorting vegetables. When he turned 12, he was put to work. Officially. As a kitchen boy. Earning $2 a month. $66 adjusted for inflation. He worked from dawn until midnight. Peeling. Scrubbing. Hauling coal to the stoves. In 1918, when the Spanish flu swept through Asheville, it came to Biltmore. The servants, living in close quarters with poor ventilation, were hit hardest. James got sick. High fever. Pneumonia. He recovered. But his lungs were damaged. He would never be strong again. When he turned 18, he was let go. The estate didn't need a weak worker. He moved to Asheville. Took odd jobs. Died in 1935. 32 years old. His death certificate lists the cause as respiratory failure. But the real cause was Biltmore. Was a system that used children. That worked them until they broke. And then discarded them. James is buried in an unmarked grave. Like Ella May. Like Margaret. Like so many others whose labor made Biltmore possible. The financial structure of the Vanderbilt family is worth examining more closely. Because the dissolution of their wealth is not just a story of bad luck or poor management. It's a story of systemic inevitability. Of what happens when a fortune is built on a single industry, concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, and subjected to the forces of taxation, inflation, and generational division. The Commodore's $105 million, enormous in 1877, was tied almost entirely to railroads. And railroads, as it turned out, were not forever. By the early 20th century, the industry was in decline. Competition from automobiles and trucks. Regulation from the federal government. Nationalization during World War I. The Vanderbilt Railroad Empire, which had once controlled transportation across the eastern United States, was broken apart. Piece by piece. By 1920, the family's railroad holdings were worth a fraction of their peak value. And the fortune, no longer generating the massive returns it once did, began to dwindle. But the spending didn't stop. The Vanderbilts, across all branches of the family, continued to live as if the money was infinite. They built more estates. The Breakers. Marble House. Rough Point. Each one costing millions. Each one requiring hundreds of thousands in annual operating costs. They traveled. They collected art. They hosted parties. They maintained appearances. Because that's what wealth demanded. Not just in the 19th century, but in the 20th. Even as the money dwindled, the performance continued. Until it couldn't anymore. The introduction of the federal estate tax in 1916 accelerated the decline. The tax, initially set at 10% on estates over $5 million, was designed specifically to prevent the kind of dynastic wealth the Vanderbilts represented. And it worked. When George died in 1914, before the estate tax took effect, Edith inherited his $15 million estate with relatively little taxation. But when Edith died in 1958, her estate was subject to a tax rate of 77%. 77%. The estate, valued at roughly $8 million, was reduced to less than $2 million after taxes. And that $2 million had to cover the operating costs of Biltmore, which by then were running at $300,000 per year. The math was unsustainable. And Edith's daughter, Cornelia, knew it. Cornelia Vanderbilt was born in 1900. Grew up in Biltmore. The only child of George and Edith. She was, by all accounts, deeply ambivalent about her inheritance. She loved the house. The beauty. The history. But she also understood the cost. Not just the financial cost. But the human cost. The moral cost. And she struggled, her entire life, with the question of what to do with it. Cornelia married twice. First to John Cecil, a British aristocrat. They had 2 sons, William and George. Then, after divorcing John, she married Guy Bear, an artist. She spent much of her later life in Europe. Away from Biltmore. Away from the weight of it. When Edith died in 1958, Cornelia inherited the estate. And she immediately began the process of transferring it to her sons. Because she didn't want it. Didn't want the responsibility. Didn't want to be the keeper of a monument built on suffering. Her sons, William and George Cecil, had no such qualms. They saw Biltmore not as a burden, but as an opportunity. And they transformed it. The transformation of Biltmore from a private estate to a commercial enterprise is one of the most successful examples of adaptive reuse in American history. But it's also a story of commodification. Of turning history into product. Of monetizing suffering. The Cecil brothers hired business consultants. Marketing experts. They studied the tourism industry. Learned how to brand. How to sell. How to turn a house into an experience. They invested millions in infrastructure. Parking lots. Gift shops. Restaurants. A winery. They expanded the tours. Added audio guides. Special exhibits. Behind-the-scenes access. They turned Biltmore into a destination. And it worked. By the 1980s, Biltmore was generating millions in annual revenue. By the 2000s, over 100 million. Today, over 300 million. The estate employs over 2,000 people. But most of them are not well paid. The tour guides earn between $12 and $15 per hour. $39 to $49 adjusted for inflation. The housekeeping staff, the people who clean the estate every night after the tourists leave, they earn minimum wage. $7.25 in North Carolina. $24 adjusted for inflation. Less than what Ella May earned in 1901. Adjusted for inflation, of course. But still. The irony is inescapable. The descendants of the Vanderbilts are billionaires. Their net worth, derived almost entirely from Biltmore, is estimated at over $1.2 billion. And the people who make Biltmore function, who clean the toilets and mow the lawns and smile at the tourists, they earn poverty wages. The system hasn't changed. It's just been updated. Made more efficient. More profitable. More invisible. The question of what Biltmore represents in the 21st century is complicated. On one hand, it's a historical landmark. A testament to American craftsmanship and ambition. A place where people can come and learn about the Gilded Age. About architecture. About history. On the other hand, it's a monument to inequality. A place that celebrates wealth without acknowledging its cost. That allows 1 million people a year to walk through its rooms and never once confront the question of who paid for this. Who suffered for this? Who died for this? The estate's marketing emphasizes the beauty. The grandeur. The romance. The website describes Biltmore as a place where memories are made. Where families can come and experience the elegance of a bygone era. But whose memories? Whose elegance? Not Ella May's. Not Thomas Acker's. Not Margaret O'Brien's. Not James's. Their memories are not part of the story Biltmore sells. Their elegance, their lives, their suffering, it's been erased. Replaced with a narrative of benevolent wealth. Of a family that built something beautiful and shared it with the world. But that narrative is a lie. Or at least, a half-truth. Because yes, the Vanderbilts built something beautiful. But they built it on the backs of people whose names we don't know. Whose lives we don't remember. Whose suffering we don't acknowledge. And that erasure is not an accident. It's a choice. Made every day. By the estate's management. By the tour guides. By the marketing department. By the millions of tourists who walk through and never ask the question. Who paid for this? If you're still watching, you're not here because this is comfortable. You're here because you understand that real history, honest history, is never comfortable. It's messy. It's contradictory. It forces us to hold things in tension that we'd rather keep separate. Beauty and suffering. Progress and exploitation. Memory and erasure. These stories exist because some people still believe that truth matters more than comfort. If that's you, if that's why you're still here, then you already know. Subscription isn't about entertainment. It's about commitment. To the kind of content that refuses to look away. That refuses to let the past stay buried. That insists on naming what's been erased. That's the choice. And it's yours. The legacy of Biltmore is still being written. The house still stands. The tours continue. The revenue flows. The family profits. But the questions remain. And they're getting louder. In recent years, there's been growing pressure on historic sites like Biltmore to confront their histories more honestly. To acknowledge the labor. The suffering. The cost. Some estates have responded. Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, now includes extensive exhibits on slavery. On the lives of the enslaved people who built and maintained the estate. Mount Vernon has done the same. But Biltmore has been slower. The servant quarters are part of the tour, yes. But they're presented as curiosities. As examples of how people lived back then. Not as evidence of exploitation. Not as sites of suffering. Not as places where people like Ella May died so that George Vanderbilt could have clean sheets. The framing matters. The language matters. And right now, Biltmore's language is one of celebration, not reckoning. There have been calls, from historians and activists, for Biltmore to do more. To create exhibits specifically about the workers. To research and publish their names. To acknowledge, explicitly, that the house was built on suffering. To commit a portion of the estate's profits to community reparations. To scholarship funds for the descendants of the workers. To healthcare initiatives in Asheville, addressing the generational poverty that Biltmore helped create. So far, the estate has resisted. Not openly. Not explicitly. But through inaction. Through the maintenance of a narrative that centers the Vanderbilts and marginalizes everyone else. And that resistance, that refusal to reckon, it's telling. Because it reveals what Biltmore ultimately is. Not a museum. Not a historical site. But a business. A profit-generating enterprise. And reckoning, real reckoning, is bad for business. It complicates the narrative. It makes tourists uncomfortable. And uncomfortable tourists don't buy as many souvenirs. Don't book as many hotel rooms. Don't return with their families. So the story stays simple. The Vanderbilts built a beautiful house. Come see it. Isn't it amazing? And the tourists come. And they see. And they marvel. And they leave. And nothing changes. But it could change. It should change. Because the power to change it exists. Not with the Cecil family. Not with Biltmore's management. But with us. With the people who visit. Who buy tickets. Who generate the revenue. We have the power to demand more. To demand honesty. To demand reckoning. To refuse to accept a narrative that erases suffering in the name of beauty. And if enough people demand it, if enough people refuse to accept the sanitized version of history, Biltmore will have to respond. Not because they want to. But because they have to. Because their business model depends on us. On our dollars. On our complicity. And if we withdraw that complicity, if we demand accountability, things will change. Biltmore stands. It will stand for centuries. Long after we are gone. Long after the tourists stop coming. Long after the revenue dries up and the winery closes and the hotel empties. The house will remain. Stone and wood and glass. But the people who built it, they are already gone. Erased. Forgotten. And the only way to honor them, the only way to make their suffering mean something, is to remember. To tell their stories. To say their names. Ella May Gunter. Thomas Acker. Margaret O'Brien. James. The thousands of others whose names we don't know. They built Biltmore. Not George. He paid for it. But they built it. With their hands. With their lives. And we owe them more than silence. We owe them the truth. The whole truth. The beautiful, terrible, unbearable truth. That Biltmore is a masterpiece. And a graveyard. And we must hold both. If we are to learn anything. If we are to be anything other than tourists. Walking through rooms. Marveling at beauty. And forgetting the cost. We must remember. Always. The cost.